They weren't put in chains, just thin clothes. And as the temperature dropped that first night, they became certain America had chosen to kill them with cold, not bullets. The wind found every gap in the wooden walls. It slipped under collars, through cracked boards, and into bones that were already tired from a long journey. A few of the men pressed their hands together and breathed into them, watching the fog of their own breath hang in the air like a warning. This wasn't the cold they knew. This felt sharper, meaner. Like it had teeth. Only hours earlier, the train had slowed to a crawl. When it finally stopped, the doors slid open with a heavy scrape, and a blast of icy air slammed into their faces. No shouting, no blows, just cold. The kind that makes your eyes water and your chest tighten before you can think. One of the younger soldiers stumbled, stepping down, his boots hitting frozen ground that looked pale and endless. Someone behind him muttered, almost to himself, "This is how it ends." They had been told stories. Whispered rumors passed between bunks and boxcars. America was vast and cruel. The winters were merciless. The camps were designed to break men slowly, quietly, until there was nothing left. Back home, winter meant snow on rooftops and frozen rivers you could still cross if you were careful. This felt different. This felt like a test no one planned to survive. Inside the camp, the barracks smelled of old wood and damp fabric. The blankets were thin, the kind you could see light through if you held them up. Men layered everything they had, shirts over shirts, socks doubled, coats pulled tight, but it barely helped. When night fell, the cold settled in, heavy and patient. You could hear it in the room. The small sound stopped first. Then the coughing began. One man lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting his breaths. He thought of his mother folding laundry by the stove, of the radio humming softly in the corner of the kitchen. He imagined her looking out a window, not knowing where he was or how far away this cold really was. His fingers went numb, then painful, then numb again. He wondered which part came just before dying. The guards did their rounds without a word, boots crunching on frozen ground, breath visible in the dark. They didn't laugh. They didn't sneer. That almost made it worse. Indifference felt colder than hatred. If no one cared whether you lived, then winter could do whatever it wanted. By morning, frost clung to the inside of the windows. A few men hadn't slept at all. One had wrapped his feet in a spare shirt and still couldn't feel his toes. Another sat on his bunk, staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. No one said it out loud, but the thought moved through the room all the same. If this was only the beginning, none of us would last. Days passed like that, each one colder than the last. The food was basic but steady. The rules were strict but clear. None of it mattered once the sun went down. Night was when fear did its real work. Night was when men whispered about home and stared at the door, half expecting the cold to come walking in and finish the job. And yet, something didn't fit the picture they'd been warned about. No beatings, no starvation, no deliberate cruelty. Just a strange, uncomfortable order. It left room for questions, and questions made the waiting harder. One evening, as the wind howled louder than usual, a guard paused near the barrack door longer than he needed to. He adjusted his coat, glanced inside, and then moved on without a word. A small thing, almost nothing, but a few men noticed. In a place where every detail mattered, that hesitation felt different. They were still sure winter would kill them. That belief didn't disappear overnight. But somewhere between the rattling windows and the endless nights, a quiet doubt began to form. If this place was meant to destroy them, why did it feel so unfinished? Before we go any further, if stories like this matter to you, stories that uncover the quiet, human moments hidden inside history, take a second to support the channel. Subscribe to History Captured and help keep these forgotten memories alive. Because as brutal as that winter felt, something was already shifting beyond the barbed wire. And soon, the men who feared the cold most would learn that survival doesn't always come from strength. Sometimes it comes from the people you least expect. And in the days ahead, the silence outside the camp would finally be broken. The cold hadn't killed them yet. That alone felt strange, almost suspicious, as if winter was only catching its breath. By the time the men realized they'd survived their first week, something else had settled in: routine. Not comfort, not safety, just a rhythm that made the days blur together. Morning roll call, simple meals, long hours with nothing to do but think. And thinking for a prisoner was dangerous work. Inside the camp, life moved slowly, too slowly. The barracks were still cold, though the men had learned where to sleep to avoid the worst drafts. Some claimed the bunks near the wall were warmer. Others swore the center of the room was safer. None of it was proven, but believing something, anything, helped pass the time. Food arrived on schedule, not generous but steady. Bread, soup, sometimes meat. It wasn't home, but it wasn't starvation either. That confused many of them more than hunger ever could. Back in the boxcars, they prepared themselves for cruelty. Instead, they were given rules, clear ones. Follow them and the day would end quietly. The guards remained distant, professional, faces unreadable, orders short and sharp but never cruel. A few prisoners tried to provoke them at first, testing limits, almost hoping for proof that the stories were true. Proof that America really was the monster they'd been warned about. Nothing happened. The guards simply wrote something down and moved on. Boredom became the real enemy. Men found ways to fill the hours. Some paced the fence line, counting steps. Others carved small figures from scrap wood, smoothing them until their fingers ached. A few gathered near the radio room, hoping to catch fragments of music drifting from somewhere beyond the camp. Static most days. But sometimes, just sometimes, a song slipped through. Letters were the hardest part. Paper was precious. Words even more so. Writing home meant choosing what to say and what to leave out. How do you explain cold that feels personal? How do you describe a place that isn't quite hell but isn't mercy either? Many wrote the same safe lines. I'm alive. I'm being treated fairly. Don't worry. They folded the truth into silence and hoped it would travel safely across the ocean. At night, the camp grew quiet in a way that felt unnatural. No traffic. No distant cities. Just wind, wire, and the occasional cough from a nearby bunk. Men stared at the ceiling, replaying memories they were afraid might fade. A sister's laugh, a father's hands, a street they used to walk without thinking. Some talked in whispers after lights out, not about escape, not anymore. Winter had erased those fantasies. They talked about home, about food, about whether anyone remembered them. One older soldier, his hair already thinning, would quietly hum old songs. No one ever asked him to stop. And beyond the barbed wire, life went on. The town nearby watched the camp from a distance. Church bells still rang on Sundays. Shops opened in the morning. Children walked to school with books tucked under their arms. From certain angles, you could almost forget a prison camp sat just beyond the fields, almost. At first, the townspeople avoided looking too closely. The war was far away, but its weight was everywhere. Sons, brothers, husbands gone, some fighting in Europe, some not coming back. The men behind the wire wore the same uniforms as the enemy on the radio. That was hard to ignore. Still, curiosity crept in. Farmers driving past slowed down just a little. Shopkeepers glanced toward the fences when trucks rolled by. Children asked questions their parents didn't know how to answer. Who were those men? Were they dangerous? Did they deserve to be there? Inside the camp, the prisoners noticed the looks. Brief, careful, human. It unsettled them. Hatred would have been easier to understand. Hatred had shape. These looks felt uncertain, like something unfinished. One afternoon, a prisoner working near the fence dropped his glove. It slipped through the wire and landed just outside. He stared at it for a moment, then backed away. Rules were rules. The glove stayed where it was, slowly stiffening in the cold. An hour later, during patrol, a guard stopped near that spot. He bent down, picked up the glove, and tossed it back through the fence without a word. No eye contact, no expression, just a small action done quickly as if it didn't matter, but it did. That night, the story moved through the barracks in whispers, not exaggerated, not dramatic, just shared. A reminder that something in this place didn't match the fear they'd carried across the ocean. Winter still pressed in. The cold still hurt. Men still went asleep afraid they'd wake up numb and broken. But the certainty, the absolute belief that America wanted them dead, was beginning to crack. They were prisoners. That hadn't changed. But they were also being watched, not just by guards, by people. And as the days grew shorter and the nights colder, those quiet looks from beyond the wire would start to mean more than anyone expected. They already knew the camp from the inside. What they didn't know, what unsettled them most, was who was watching from the outside. From the town's edge, the prison camp was impossible to ignore. Barbed wire caught the light at certain hours of the day. Guard towers stood stiff against the sky. Trucks came and went on a schedule everyone quietly memorized. People pretended not to notice, but they did, every single day. At first, the locals spoke about the prisoners only in fragments, short sentences. Careful words. They're Germans. They're soldiers. They're the enemy. It was easier to keep things simple, easier than thinking too hard about the fact that the war felt suddenly close. Too close. Many families in town had empty chairs at the dinner table. Letters arrived folded and unfolded so many times the creases wore thin. Radios stayed on longer than usual, voices low, listening for names that might sound familiar. The men behind the wire wore uniforms that looked like the ones responsible for all of it. That mattered. It hurt. So people kept their distance. Mothers pulled children a little closer when they passed the road near the camp. Farmers avoided stopping their trucks. Shopkeepers changed the subject when questions came up. No one wanted to admit curiosity. Curiosity felt like betrayal. But curiosity doesn't disappear just because you don't name it. Some mornings, as the prisoners lined up for roll call, they noticed shapes in the distance. A man leaning against a fence post. A woman standing still a moment too long. A child sitting on a bicycle pretending to adjust a tire. The looks were quick, almost guilty, but they were real. Inside the camp, the men tried to make sense of it. Were they being judged, studied, counted? A few joked about it, but the laughter never lasted. Being seen without being understood was its own kind of unease. In town, conversations shifted slowly. Someone mentioned that the prisoners looked young, too young. Another said they didn't look dangerous, just tired. Those comments were usually followed by silence. No one wanted to take them too far. One Sunday afternoon, church let out early. Families spilled onto the street, coats buttoned tight against the cold. As people walked home, the sound of singing drifted faintly from the camp. Not loud, not confident. Just voices, uneven and hesitant, carried by the wind. Some stopped walking. No one spoke, they just listened. A few recognized the tune even if they didn't know the words. Music had a way of crossing lines no one else dared to. When the singing faded, people moved on as if nothing had happened. But the silence that followed felt different. Children were the first to ask the questions adults avoided. Why are they here? Are they bad? Are they cold? Parents answered carefully. Sometimes they didn't answer at all. One mother said they made choices. Another said so did everyone else. Neither explanation felt complete. Winter tightened its grip. Frost stayed on the ground longer. The fields turned hard and pale. From town, it was easy to imagine how cold it must be inside the camp. Too easy. One afternoon, a boy wandered closer than he was supposed to. He stood at the edge of a field, watching the prisoners march back from work detail. Their steps were slow, uneven. One man limped. Another rubbed his hands together as if trying to wake them up. The boy's father called him back sharply. Not angry, afraid. The boy turned, but he didn't stop looking until the figures disappeared behind the fence. That night, the father sat at the kitchen table longer than usual. He stared at his hands, rough from years of work, and thought about how easily fingers went numb in the cold. Thought about how close the camp really was. In the days that followed, small things began to change. People lingered near the road. Trucks slowed down. Eyes stayed longer than they used to. No one crossed the line, not yet, but the distance felt thinner. Inside the camp, the prisoners felt it too. The air beyond the wire no longer felt empty. It felt crowded. like a room full of people pretending not to look at one another. One evening, as dusk settled in, a prisoner noticed something near the fence, a shape in the snow. He didn't move closer. He just watched as a guard approached, paused, and quietly kicked the object out of sight. No one said a word. That night, whispers filled the barracks again. Not about escape. Not about fear, about questions. Why would someone leave something there? Why would a guard hide it? Why did it feel like winter wasn't the only thing pressing in anymore? Outside the camp, the town carried on. Inside, the men waited. Between them hung something fragile and unspoken, a growing awareness that the line between enemy and human was beginning to blur. And as the cold deepened, that silence between the wire and the town wouldn't hold much longer. By the time winter fully arrived, no one needed to imagine what it could do. They were already living inside it. The cold didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, tightening its grip day by day, night by night, until even the toughest men stopped pretending they could outlast it. Snow settled thick around the camp, muting sound, swallowing color, turning everything into shades of white and gray. The barbed wire looked sharper against it, meaner. Inside the barracks, breath stayed visible long after sunrise. Men woke with stiff joints and aching fingers, their bodies slow to respond, as if sleep had drained what little warmth they had left. Some mornings, boots froze solid by the door. Socks were pulled on damp. Coats felt heavier, not warmer. Illness followed the cold like a shadow. It started with coughs that refused to go away. Then fevers. A few men tried to hide it, afraid of being taken somewhere worse. Others were too weak to pretend. They lay on their bunks staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind batter the walls, wondering how many nights like this a body could survive. The younger ones still talked about endurance, about toughness, about pride. The older men didn't argue. They just watched and waited, knowing winter didn't care what you believed. Work details continued whenever the weather allowed. Snow had to be cleared, paths kept open. The prisoners moved slowly, shoulders hunched, hands numb inside thin gloves. Each breath burned. Each step felt deliberate, careful, as if the ground itself might turn against them. Beyond the fence, the town felt the winter too, but differently. Homes glowed at dusk. Smoke curled from chimneys. Windows trapped warmth and light. People complained about the cold the way people always had, but they did it indoors, with coffee mugs warming their hands. It was impossible not to notice the contrast. From certain roads, you could see the prisoners working in the open fields, dark figures against endless white. People noticed. They tried not to stare, tried not to think about how long anyone could stand out there. One night the temperature dropped suddenly, sharply. The kind of cold that settles deep, turning even silence brittle. Inside the camp, men layered every scrap of fabric they owned. Blankets were shared. Bodies pressed close, an unspoken agreement that warmth mattered more than space. Still, sleep came in fragments. A man cried out in the night, half dreaming, half delirious. Another whispered prayers he hadn't said in years. Someone laughed once, short, hollow, then went quiet. No one asked why. By morning, 2 prisoners couldn't stand. Their faces were pale, lips tinged blue. Medics were called, orders were given. The camp moved on, but the message was clear. Winter wasn't testing them anymore. It was taking what it wanted. Word spread quickly. Fear returned, heavier than before. Not sharp panic, something slower. Resigned. Men stopped talking about spring, stopped counting days. Survival shrank to smaller goals. Make it tonight, make it through the night, wake up. And yet outside the wire something shifted. People in town talked about the cold too, but now the camp came up in those conversations. Quietly, carefully. Someone mentioned the prisoners working without coats. Someone else said they'd seen smoke barely rising from the barracks. A pause followed. Always a pause. That same night, a shape appeared near the fence. It wasn't obvious, just a dark bundle against the snow, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. A guard noticed during patrol. He slowed, looked around. Then instead of calling it in, he nudged the bundle closer to the wire, just enough that it rested within reach. By morning, it was gone. Inside the barracks, a blanket, Thick, heavy, unfamiliar, had changed hands without explanation. No one asked where it came from. They just pulled it tighter and felt, for the first time in days, something close to relief. More appeared after that, not every night, not openly, a scarf here, extra socks there, sometimes food, always small, always quiet, like winter itself but kinder. The men didn't celebrate, they didn't even smile much. They just noticed they weren't as cold as before. That fewer coughs echoed at night. That someone somewhere had decided they didn't deserve to freeze. From town, people watched the camp the same way, but now with purpose, with intent. A bag left near the road, a coat forgotten on a fence post. No one spoke of it. Speaking made it dangerous. Inside the wire, belief shifted again. Maybe winter wouldn't kill them. Maybe America hadn't chosen that after all, but help like this couldn't stay hidden forever. And as the snow deepened and the nights grew longer, the quiet kindness beyond the fence would soon demand a choice, from the guards, from the town, and from the prisoners themselves. Because once humanity shows itself, even winter can't force it back into silence. They knew the help was real now. The only question left was how long it could last without being stopped. What began as quiet relief slowly turned into quiet risk. Every blanket, every scarf, every bit of food carried the same unspoken weight. Someone had to bring it. Someone had to ignore it. Someone had to accept it without asking questions that could ruin everything. Inside the camp, the men learned to recognize the signs. A guard slowing his pace. A patrol route changing just slightly. A shape near the fence that hadn't been there before sunset. Nothing was ever handed directly. Nothing was acknowledged out loud. Survival moved through glances and timing. The prisoners changed too. They stopped rushing toward the fence. Stopped staring too long. Gratitude was dangerous if it looked like expectation. They treated the kindness the way you treat fire in the cold, close enough to feel it, careful not to let it spread. One man wrapped a donated coat around his shoulders and stood still for a long time, just breathing. Another ran his fingers along the stitching of a scarf, the kind you'd only make if you cared whether someone stayed warm. These things didn't come from warehouses. They came from homes. That knowledge settled deep. In town, the decision to help was never discussed openly. It didn't need to be. People felt it before they understood it. You couldn't see men freezing in open fields and pretend it had nothing to do with you, not forever. The first person to act wasn't brave in the way stories usually describe. It was a woman doing laundry. She held up a wool sweater her husband no longer wore, the elbows patched, the collar stretched thin. She folded it, unfolded it, then folded it again. By nightfall, it was gone from the house. Others followed, quietly. A farmer left extra potatoes near a fence line where snow drifted high. A shopkeeper wrapped bread in paper and placed it behind an old shed, pretending he'd simply forgotten it there. A mother sent her son to lose a pair of gloves on the road near the camp. No one called it kindness, they called it necessity. Cold didn't care whose side you were on. The guards noticed, of course, they always noticed. Some pretended not to. Others made small adjustments, turning their backs at the right moment, stretching patrols just long enough. A few struggled with it. Orders were orders. But winter had a way of softening hard lines. One guard, younger than most, stood watch one night as snow fell thick and fast. He stared at the fence longer than usual, at the dark shapes moving slowly behind it. He thought of his own family, warm and safe just a few towns away. When he heard a faint sound near the trees, he didn't raise his rifle. He just waited until it stopped. Inside the barracks, the mood shifted again, not to happiness, but to something steadier. Men shared what they received. No one hoarded. No one asked who deserved more. Cold had stripped them down to basics. Warmth was communal. Conversations changed too. They spoke less about dying and more about remembering, about what they'd do if they survived, about food they missed, streets they wanted to walk again. For the first time since arriving, the future didn't feel like a mistake. Still, fear lingered. What if the help stopped? What if someone was caught? What if kindness turned into punishment? Those questions hovered every night unanswered. One evening, a siren sounded briefly, too briefly. Men froze in place, hearts raced. Guards shouted orders sharper than usual. For a moment it felt like the world was snapping back into its old shape. Then it passed. No searches, no punishment, no missing blankets. The next morning, work details were announced as usual. But this time, something new was added. A few prisoners were assigned outside the camp under supervision. Farm work. Road clearing. Labor the town needed done. It was presented as routine, practical, necessary, but everyone understood what it really meant. The wire was no longer the only line between them. As the men prepared for their first day beyond the fence, they pulled on coats that hadn't been theirs weeks earlier. They stepped into boots that no longer felt like ice. And as they walked past the guards, they didn't look up. They didn't need to. Because the help that began in silence had grown into something larger, something visible, something that could no longer pretend it wasn't happening. And once prisoners and townspeople shared the same cold ground, the same work, and the same breath in the winter air, the story between them was about to change forever. They stepped beyond the wire carrying more than tools. They carried the quiet weight of being seen. The first morning outside the camp felt unreal. Snow creaked under their boots as they walked in a loose line, guards spaced just far enough apart to remind everyone where the rules still stood. The town lay ahead, close enough to touch now. Smoke rose from chimneys. A dog barked somewhere. Life, ordinary and warm, moved on without stopping for them. Work began without ceremony. Shovels were handed out. Hands pointed toward frozen roads and snow-heavy fields. No speeches, no warnings, just the simple expectation that work would be done. And so they worked, slow at first, careful, bodies still learning how to move after weeks of confinement. The cold followed them, but it felt different out here, less suffocating. Maybe because movement kept blood flowing. Maybe because eyes were on them now, not just from guard towers, but from windows, doorways, and passing trucks. People watched. At first, no one spoke. The prisoners shoveled, cleared paths, hauled wood, heads down, focused. They knew better than to invite attention. Attention could change its mind. Then it happened, small and ordinary. A farmer stopped his truck nearby. He didn't get out, just sat there for a moment, engine idling, watching the men work. One of the prisoners straightened up, unsure what to do. The farmer lifted a hand, not a wave exactly, more like acknowledgement. Then he drove on. It shouldn't have mattered. It did. As days passed, the work details grew routine. The same roads, the same fields, the same cold. Faces became familiar. Prisoners began to recognize who lived where, who watched quietly, who looked away, who lingered. Words came slowly, a nod, a mourning, a shared look when a shovel hit ice too hard. Language didn't matter much. Meaning did. One afternoon, while clearing a barn roof, a prisoner slipped. The ladder shifted. He would have fallen if a local man hadn't grabbed it without thinking. For a second they stood there frozen, hands gripping the same rung, eyes locked in mutual shock. "Careful," the local said, voice rough. The prisoner nodded. Yes, that was all, but afterward hands shook for different reasons. Lunch breaks were quiet at first. Prisoners ate what they were given, sitting apart, respectful of distance. Locals kept their space too, until one day a woman set down a thermos nearby and walked away without a word. Steam curled from the lid. The prisoners waited. Looked to the guards. No reaction. One man poured the coffee, passed the cup. The warmth traveled faster than the drink itself. Music came next, not planned, not performed, just humming at first. A tune one of the prisoners remembered from home. It drifted through the air as he worked, soft and unguarded. A local boy nearby started whistling along, not knowing the words but catching the melody. No one stopped them. Conversations followed. Broken English. Gestures. Laughter that surprised everyone when it slipped out. Someone talked about farming back home. Someone else compared winters. The differences mattered less than the similarities. Even the guards changed. They still watched, still enforced rules, but their posture softened. Orders sounded less sharp. Sometimes they turned their heads when conversations lasted a little too long. Inside the camp, nights felt different now. Men returned exhausted but lighter. They talked about faces, about voices, about the way the town smelled, wood smoke and bread and something familiar they couldn't name. They spoke about work like it mattered again, like it meant something beyond survival. Winter didn't disappear, it still hurt, still punished careless hands and tired bodies, but it no longer felt like an executioner waiting patiently. It felt like something shared, and that changed everything. One evening, as the prisoners marched back toward the wire, a child stood by the road holding a scarf. He hesitated, then dropped it in the snow and ran. No one chased him. No one scolded him. The scarf was blue. Back in the barracks, the man who received it didn't sleep right away. He held it for a long time, thinking about how small acts traveled further than armies ever could. The lines between enemy and neighbor were fading now, not erased, but thinner, fragile, real. And as winter dragged on, those shared hours of work, those brief moments of understanding, were building towards something no one had planned. Because when the war finally loosened its grip, the hardest part wouldn't be surviving the cold. It would be learning how to say goodbye. They had learned how to live through the winter. What they hadn't learned yet was how to leave what it had given them. The news didn't arrive with celebration. It came quietly, passed from guard to guard, confirmed in clipped sentences that sounded almost unreal. The war was ending. Germany had fallen. For a moment, no one knew what to do with that information. Inside the camp, men stood still as if waiting for the rest of the sentence. Some felt relief first. A sudden lightness, sharp enough to sting. Fighting was over. The dying might finally stop. Others felt something heavier rise in its place. Defeat carried its own kind of silence, questions with no clean answers, a future that felt uncertain and exposed. And then came the part no one had expected. They were going home. The word moved through the barracks slowly. Home. It sounded familiar and distant at the same time, like a song you remembered but couldn't quite finish. Men packed what little they owned, folded clothes, tucked letters into pockets, counted gifts that couldn't be explained on paper, scarves, gloves, photographs, memories. Outside the wire, the town heard the news too. People stopped what they were doing when trucks passed with different energy now. Less guarded, more final. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Some nodded. Some looked away. No one had prepared for this moment, even though everyone knew it was coming. Work details continued for a short while, but they felt different. Every road cleared felt like the last one. Every shared cup of coffee carried an unspoken weight. People talked more now, less careful than before. One farmer shook a prisoner's hand without thinking, realized what he'd done only after it was over. Neither pulled away. A woman pressed a small package into a guard's hands and asked him quietly to make sure it reached the one with the limp. The guard didn't ask questions. He nodded once. Children hovered nearby, unsure whether to wave or stay still. One did both, lifting his hand halfway, then dropping it, embarrassed. The prisoner smiled anyway. Inside the camp, nights were restless again, but not with fear. Men lay awake replaying moments they hadn't expected to carry with them. The sound of church bells drifting across snow. The way coffee smelled when it was shared, not rationed. The look on a stranger's face when they realized you weren't what they'd been taught to hate. Some men worried about what waited for them back home. Ruined cities. Families changed by years of absence. Guilt that would not fade easily. America had been a prison, but also a place where survival had come with unexpected grace. Departure day arrived under a pale sky. The prisoners lined up one last time, bags slung over shoulders, coats pulled tight. The same guards stood watch, but something in their posture had softened. Orders were given, names were checked. The routine held even as everything else shifted. As they marched toward the trucks, the town gathered at a distance. No banners, no speeches, just people standing in the cold, watching men they had once feared leave their lives. A prisoner spotted the boy with the blue scarf. The boy stood beside his father, hands buried deep in his pockets, For a second their eyes met. The prisoner touched the scarf at his neck. The boy nodded once. That was enough. Engines started, doors closed, the trucks rolled forward. Snow crunched beneath heavy tires. No one cheered. A few people raised their hands. Others simply watched until the road curved and the camp disappeared from view. Inside the truck, a man pressed his forehead to the cold metal wall. He thought of winter, of wire, of warmth that had come from strangers. He wondered how he would explain this place to anyone who hadn't lived it. Behind them, the camp stood quiet, empty in a way it had never been before. Beyond it, the town returned to its routines, changed in ways that wouldn't show from the outside. The war was over. The winter was ending. But the story didn't stop there. Because years later, long after uniforms were folded away and borders were drawn, the memory of that cold season, and the kindness that survived it, would refuse to fade. And some journeys, it turned out, didn't end with going home. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that humanity can survive even in the darkest winters, then take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe to History Captured and help us keep sharing the real stories that history almost forgot. And if you know someone who believes kindness no longer exists, share this with them. Because sometimes the most powerful moments in history happen quietly, when no one thinks they'll be remembered.